Happy Monday, everybody. Welcome back to the channel for another episode of the Ask Me Anything series. I hope you all had a great weekend. I decided to change things up a little bit for this week's episode. Usually I just make a post on the community tab for you guys to comment your questions under. However, this week I still made the community tab post, but I also made a post on Instagram and Twitter just so I could get it out to as many of you as possible. So if you use Instagram or Twitter and you don't follow me yet, be sure to go do so. The links are down below in the description. I do also want to shout out my second channel once again, which is for short form NHL content like 1 to 3 minute clips. The link to that channel is down below at the top of the description. I've been having a lot of fun uploading over there pretty much every single day, and you guys have been showing a lot of love as well, so thank you for that. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. This first question comes from Goulinator on Twitter, who says, with Boldy getting 7x7 earlier today, is it far-fetched to say Caufield may receive $9 million for 8 seasons? No, I don't think that's far-fetched at all. One thing Minnesota obviously did when signing Boldy to this deal is they are signing him before he really has his big breakthrough in hopes to save a couple $1,000,000, similar to what New Jersey did with Jack Hughes, and that deal looks great. Same with Ottawa and Tim Stützle. When it comes to Caufield, though, Montreal can't sign him to an extension before he really breaks out because he's breaking out right now. I mean, Cole Caufield's probably going to finish the season with 40 plus goals, may even push 50 if he gets really hot. So I definitely think $9 million for the next 8 years is a pretty solid guess for what Caufield's next contract could look like. One thing is for sure, I imagine Caufield and his agent were all smiles when they seen the news of the Boldy extension, because it kind of sets the precedent for young wingers kind of in that age group. I think Lucas Raymond is going to get a similar deal to the one Boldy signed. The next question we have comes from Andrew on Twitter, who says, does Zdina have a spot in the lineup when he returns? If not, what should they do with him? I'm definitely going to say no. I mean, Zdina was scratched on opening night. He didn't even make the opening night lineup, and that is when Robbie Fabry wasn't playing, Jonathan Berggren was in Grand Rapids, and now those two are both in the Red Wings lineup, and Berggren, there's no way he can be sent back down or taken out of the lineup with how well he's playing. Maybe after the trade deadline, if the Red Wings decide to move guys like Adam Ernie and Oscar Sundqvist, then Zdina could find a consistent spot in the lineup. But even with those guys gone, like Elmer Soderblom, I would even say, is now ahead of Zdina on the depth chart. It's definitely not looking good for Zdina in Detroit, at least. I think it's probably time to start thinking about a change of scenery, whether that happens in a trade or if there's just no interest in Zdina on the trade market. I could honestly see a scenario where he's placed on waivers. We've seen Steve Yzerman is not afraid to make those tough decisions in terms of placing players on waivers. Obviously Jacob Verona a few weeks ago, and now more recently Alex Nedeljkovic just cleared waivers today. So it's a real shame. If you're one of my OG subscribers, you probably remember how excited I was when the Red Wings selected Filip Zdina back in 2018. I really just find it difficult to envision Filip Zdina as a long-term fit on the Red Wings at this point, now with so many guys just kind of passing him over on the depth chart. But I will say, if he doesn't find success in Detroit, I definitely hope he finds it somewhere else. Moving on now, the next question we have comes from NattyGuy95 on Instagram, who says, if a team were to be crazy enough to pick up Carlson in a trade, who would it be? One team that keeps getting thrown around, and I actually kind of like this idea, is the Ottawa Senators. I think it'd be really cool to see him return now on the other side of the rebuild when the Senators are starting to get more competitive. I think Ottawa could obviously use him. They need some help on the back end. I think that would make a really formidable top four with the likes of Thomas Chabot, Jake Sanderson, and Artem Zub. However, I don't know how likely that would be, considering it was reported on that the Sharks are looking for 3 first-round picks for Erik Karlsson at 18% retained. If I'm the Senators, I probably don't want to give up that kind of draft capital for, an aging Erik Karlsson, especially considering the fact that there's no guarantee Ottawa makes the playoffs this season or even next season. Even though next year they probably will be closer than they are this season, there's still potential like 1 or 2 of those picks could end up in the lottery, right? So I just think that would be too much of a risk. Next up, this question comes from Aaron Kirk on Instagram, who says, do you think it's time for the Preds to rebuild? And yes, I absolutely do think it's time for the Predators to head in a different direction. This is a team that really doesn't have a lot of young talent. They're a veteran team. Their 3 highest paid defensemen are all 32 years of age or older. 5 of their highest paid forwards, with the exception of Philip Forsberg, are on the wrong side of 30. This is a team that I definitely think should look to move some of those veteran guys sooner rather than later while they still have value. The longer this goes on with the Predators just kind of being a mediocre team, the older these guys get, the less value they have, because say if they just keep going at this rate year in and year out, I think eventually they'll be at risk of kind of doing what the Red Wings did towards the end of their playoff streak, where Ken Holland just tried to hold on way too long, and then when it got to the point where he basically had no choice but to rebuild, Detroit really had nothing in terms of future assets, and the team was not set up for the future at all, which led to the rebuild being very, very long. So if you're they're Predators, that's definitely something you don't want to do if they don't decide to move a bunch of pieces at the trade deadline and they try to make a push for the playoffs this season. I think in the off season, they have to head in a different direction. Next up, this question comes from Blues Twos King 6655, who says, how would you feel as a Leafs fan knowing you'll play Tampa in the first round already midway into the season, and what's your take on their chances of making it past the first round this year in general? Yeah, I mean, that is kind of true. We pretty much know that it's going to be Leafs versus Lightning in the first round unless Boston really cools off and Toronto catches Boston, or if Florida picks it up and catches Tampa Bay somehow, but it's looking like it's going to be a 2-3 matchup between Tampa and Toronto. And honestly, if I'm a Maple Leafs fan, I would want to play Tampa Bay as opposed to Boston, who is just on a whole other level this season, and Toronto knows they can compete with Tampa Bay. They took them to 7 games last year. They were up 3-2 in overtime of Game 6, 1 shot away from advancing. The Maple Leafs look great this year. Obviously, they've been, outside of like the first 2 weeks of the season, one of the best teams in the NHL, so I definitely think they have a good shot to go on a run in the playoffs this year. For the Leafs, I think it's just all about getting out of that first round, and then it's just going to be like 1,000 tons of weight off of their shoulders. The next question we have comes from Quinn VG, who says, what do you think the Oilers should do via trade market to make a push? You have to think there's pressure to make a move after last year's success and this year's mediocrity, and also really appreciate the support. I think they could definitely use a top 4 defenseman. I'm not quite sure who that would be. It was rumored that they were poking around on Ivan Provorov, but I don't really think he's the kind of defenseman this team necessarily needs. And then outside of that, I think they should definitely target a middle 6 winger. I think they have Derek Ryan playing on the first line right now with Connor McDavid. That is less than ideal, to say the least. And then eventually you'll be getting Evander Kane back, so if they do go out and get a winger, and then you also get Kane back, that's some much needed depth there, some much needed secondary scoring. A winger that I actually have in mind who I think would be a good target for the Edmonton Oilers is actually Gustav Nyquist in Columbus. He's in the final year of his contract, and Ken Holland and Nyquist obviously have that connection from their time spent together in Detroit, so I definitely think that could be a fit, and I think they can make the money work as well, especially if Columbus retains 50%. That would only be what, like $2.5 million. The next question we have comes from Ryan Plunkett Hockey, who says, do you think there should be an award for best defensive defenseman in the league because of how overlooked most of them really are? I think there should be, for sure. I think the NHL should definitely add some more awards in the next couple of years. I think a most improved player award would be awesome, and then defensive player of the year award, because when you're talking about the Norris Trophy, it is obviously a little bit about defensive play, but for an example, like Erik Carlson is just running away with it this year because of his insane offensive production. He isn't having a great defensive season by any means, but because of those offensive numbers, he's gonna get the recognition, right? Moving on now, this question comes from Hugh Barkhurst, who says, is there a bottom team that you would most likely want to see land Bedard, or do you have no preference whatsoever? I do actually have a preference. I want him to go to the Anaheim Ducks, number one, because then he would not be in Detroit's conference and they wouldn't have to play him as much in the run of a year. I want him as far away from the Red Wings as possible if he's not wearing their jersey. And reason number two, I mean, come on, him and Zegras playing together, are you kidding me? That would be insane. Definitely would be one of the most fun duos to watch in the league. Moving on now, this next question comes from, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that name because I'm just going to butcher it, but you can see it there on the screen. In your opinion, why hasn't Matthews been up there in goals with McDavid, Thompson, etc.? I think it's definitely because he's been playing at less than 100% pretty much for the majority of the season. The Leafs actually decided to rest Auston Matthews for a couple of games here recently, which I think is a good idea. I mean, you're likely going to finish second place in the Atlantic Division. You want Matthews as healthy as possible as we get closer and closer to the playoffs. So I would definitely say the fact that he's been playing through something pretty much all season long is the biggest reason why he hasn't been quite as dominant this season as he was last season, but he's still playing well. He's still been one of, I think, the best forwards in the league in terms of two-way game. This next question comes from Chris Boots 5768, who says, got any hockey podcast recommendations? Yeah, I do for sure. I'll list off the ones that I listen to religiously. 32 Thoughts with Elliot Friedman and Jeff Merrick is a really good one, especially if you want like the inside scoops. Obviously, Elliot Friedman is one of the more prevalent insiders in the game. Another one would be the Steve Dangle podcast. I listen to that one religiously as well, even though I'm not a Leafs fan and there is a lot of Leafs talk on that podcast. They do cover pretty much all the big news in the NHL, not just the Maple Leafs and stuff like that. The other one that I listen to all the time is the Winged Wheel podcast, but obviously that is centered around the Red Wings. They do talk about, the big news in the league here and there, but the majority of the conversations you'll hear throughout the run of an episode is about the Red Wings. And lastly, I will listen to Spit and Chicklets here and there if I'm really intrigued about the guests that they have on for an interview, but I definitely don't catch every episode. And now for the final question of this week's episode, this one comes from User, who asks, who won the Verona Manta trade. Honestly, right now it's looking like neither team won that deal. Obviously, we know the deal with Jacob Verona. He was in the player assistance program, came back and then was placed on waivers, obviously cleared and has been playing in the AHL ever since, and he's actually been healthy scratched in the AHL twice. And Anthony Manta, obviously he served as a healthy scratch for the Washington Capitals multiple times since they've kind of been getting back healthy. I guess maybe you could lean Detroit in terms of who won the deal just because the Red Wings got that first round pick, which they used on goaltender Sebastian Cossa, but even Cossa isn't lighting the world on fire. I think he has a sub 900 save percentage in the ECHL. Definitely one of the weirder trades to look back on. I don't think anybody could have expected it to turn out like this early on in the deal too. It only happened like 2 years ago. So that is going to wrap up this week's episode of the Ask Me Anything series. As always, I do want to give a huge thank you to every single one of you who took the time to come up with a question and leave it on either the community tab post, the Instagram post, or the Twitter post. Even the ones that don't get featured in the video, just know I read every single one and I appreciate all of you guys. If you enjoyed this episode and you want to see another one next week, then be sure to drop a like on this video. That is the best way to show your support. And most importantly, if this was your first time checking out the channel and you want more NHL content just like this, be sure to hit the subscribe button and I'll talk to you all soon.